Good morning, everyone here, and good morning to the people online. Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to talk about the book, which really has many facets and depends how you want to look at it. It's the life of a Baghdadi family. It's about trade and colonialism. It's about family rifts and issues facing dynasties. It's about globalization in the 19th century and what it meant for global traders. It's about Anglicization and the desperate need for immigrant families, wherever they are, to be accepted into new homelands, and why some dynasties decline and others continue. There are really a number of major characters in the book. David Sassoon, and I will come back and talk about him, was the founder of the dynasty. Then his oldest son, Abdullah. And you will see between brackets all the names, or at least here, 2 or 3 of them, have been anglicized. Most of them anglicized their names. So Abdullah becomes Albert at some point, and I'll talk about that. His second son, Elias, who really opened China after the Opium Wars and when China became open for foreigners. And one of the great discoveries of this book that really enthralled me is finding a woman who was the only CEO at the time of a global trading firm at the end of 19th century. What is really truly remarkable about her? There were a lot of matriarchs all over the world, but not a CEO in our definition today, running day-to-day activities, overseeing all the issues, no different from any CEO. And there is a whole chapter dedicated about her and about all the conspiracies against her as a woman to push her out. And then Victor Sassoon, the last of the dynasties, and you can see that he died only in 1961. He moved the business to China totally and changed the business into real estate. If any one of you go to Shanghai, you will see there is the huge Sassoon building, which is the Fairmont Hotel today. Of course, there are a lot of other characters. There is Flora's husband, Farhad's husband, Salman. There is the famous poet of World War I, Siegfried Sassoon. There is actually another woman who in 1916 became the first editor of a national newspaper in the UK. And again, it's really remarkable. Remember, in 1916, women could not vote in Britain, but here is, and in fact, at some point, she was controlling the 2 major newspapers in the country. Why did I choose to do this? And I talk about it in the beginning of the book, that I actually was never interested in the history of the family. But I came across this incredible trove of information. Now, this is a combination of 3 languages. It's actually Arabic. It's actually a Baghdadi Jewish dialect in Arabic. But all it is, it's written in Hebrew letters. That's it. But you need all 3 to figure it out. You need to know the Arabic, you need to know the dialect, and you need to know the Hebrew. Note a few things. This is really, really typical of the correspondence of the time. No paragraphs. The beginning is very formal, very respectable, to whoever. The ending is very formal, wish you and all the family, health, happiness, whatever it is. But in the middle, it jumps from one subject to another, which made it hellish to understand, because there is no point, there is no full stop, no period, no paragraph, which made it it's interesting going back to Farha. When she came to take over, she said, this is nonsense. It's impossible to deal with it. She moved it to what we today know, like bullet points. So you have 6, 7 points, and everyone had to address those bullet points as they came in her thinking. There is a lot of criticism in this correspondence, about the traits that did not go well. One of the things that really kind upset me at the end of the research, very little emotions, very little about private feelings. How do I feel about A or B? And obviously there were major issues facing the family. You see the facts, but you don't see behind them how each one of them felt. Baghdad. So the family lived in Baghdad for almost 2,500 years. But in each, of course, Baghdad in the last 500 years was part of the Ottoman Empire. Each province had its own governor and its own Sarraf Bashi, which is the tax collector. In today's jargon, call it Minister of Finance. Both these appointments, the governor and the tax collector, were direct appointees by the Sultan in Constantinople. The father of David Sassoon was the Sarraf Bashi, was the tax collector. So for 25 years, which was very long, this comes in what is called Farman, which is an order that comes out from the Ottoman, from the emperor, sign and seal. So governor changed, Sarraf Bashi, the tax collectors changed. As it happened, one of the governors that arrived in the 1820s was very, very corrupt. And one of his tricks, if one could call that, he would arrest a member of a wealthy family, and you have to pay a ransom, basically, to release. He did this with David, until the father paid a ransom. But the minute he was released, the father realized that this is an old trick. It's going to happen again and again. So he packed his son with his wife and young family and left through Basra to Iran. There were many reports, by the way, that there was anti-Semitism. That is totally untrue and unfounded. And the reality is the siblings of David Sassoon stayed behind. I'm actually the descendant of one of those siblings who stayed until, the family, until the 1970s, so 140 years after David Sassoon left. The interesting thing, once David went, they crossed to Bushehr, and Bushehr was in southern Iran, but it was a growing port. And the father of David died a year while they were in Bushehr, trying to figure out really what to do. So a lot of merchant families have moved from Baghdad. They would go to the Gulf. So I found families that moved to what is today Bahrain, Kuwait, other places. Some stayed in Iran particularly, or as a time known as Persia, particularly in Isfahan. What is really fascinating, David started meeting traders, sailors, merchants, and came up with this idea of going to Bombay. Remember, he knew no one there. And to move your family there, I mean, think about it, even in today's sense, but then where you had no information whatsoever, it was really a revolution. So when David Sassoon arrived in Bombay, sometimes in 1831-32, he began a new chapter in the history of the family. Bombay's inhabitants at the time numbered no more than 200,000, which is hard to understand given that it is today about 27-28 million. But they were really very diverse. Hindus, Muslims, Parsis, Armenians, Portuguese, Jewish. There was a Jewish community in Bombay from the 16th century. There was also what is known native Jew caste that basically they came in the 16th century, and there were what is known Arab Jews from the Ottoman provinces of Baghdad, Basra, and Aleppo. There was a third from Cochin, and a fourth, which were all Persian speaking, from Afghanistan, Bukhara, and Mashhad. And the migration of these Arab Jews was strictly based on economic reason to take advantage of commercial opportunities in India. By 1837, one traveler estimated the number of Baghdadi Jews at 350, which represented less than 1% of the total population. What is really interesting, neither David nor his father had any inkling about doing trade. They were not in the trading business. They were not merchants. They were government officials in a sense, but they had two intangible assets. One, extensive contacts in the Gulf and Persia, and two, incredible reputation throughout the Ottoman Empire, the Gulf, and Persia. Yet, with all this, it must have been really daunting to take his young family and cross the Arabian Sea to a foreign city. Family was of immense importance to David Sassoon. His first wife died after the birth of their fourth child. They had 2 daughters, 2 sons. She died, which was, by the way, very normal. I recently came across some statistics, even in Europe, you know, that a lot of children either died or the mother, unfortunately, died. He married a second wife already back in Baghdad. And in Bombay, they had together 10 children who survived. Wow. So we do not know how many did not survive. And these 10, so together and he really made very, very clear that there is no, different from the first wife and the second, and they were all traded. And never in the 100 years of the archive you see anyone referring to anyone else as half brother or half sister. They were brothers and sisters. So 14 in total. And I call it in the small army that he dispersed around Asia and around the world to create this incredible network. Once in Bombay, David came to the conclusion that the fate and success of the family had to be tied to the British Empire. Remember, there was only one superpower at the time, one empire at the time, and that was Britain. And so the firm of David Sassoon began a long connection serving British colonial, economic, and political interests. Although he neither set foot in Britain nor spoke English, David was granted British citizenship in recognition of his services. He was fluent in Arabic, Hebrew, Persian, and Turkish, and learned Hindustani after arriving in Bombay, but never English. And actually, 20 years after his arrival, he swore the oath of allegiance to the British, but he signed it in Hebrew. And he never really, when he became well-known and wealthy, he always, this is Bombay, as you can see, there is really not a lot in it. This is David. I mean, the important thing here, he always is dressed formally in his Arab uniform, and when he addressed the British, it was always in Arabic. That was the language that he really kind of believed in. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about the connection to Baghdad and Arabic, at least by the first and second generation. This is the oath of allegiance that he signed. It's fascinating because he really never understood why he is pledging allegiance not only to a sovereign, but to a corporation, East India Company. Well, as we all know, that East India Company was really until 1857 officially running India and not the British government. One of the fascinating things that he insisted that all his children be sent back to Baghdad for training, to learn the Arabic language, and to create really that affiliation. Abdullah continued with this, and it's interesting. In one letter, he mandated that all clerks in Bombay be able to write in Arabic, and in another expressed surprise and irritation at the ability of the clerks in Hong Kong to write the language properly. David was by nature risk averse, studied every possible difficulty. In 1843-44, he sent his second son, Elias, to explore the possibility of expanding into China, and spent time in Canton, Hong Kong, Shanghai. And of course, this coincided with the end of the First Opium War, 1839-1842, and the opening of Shanghai to foreigners. Elias settled in Shanghai in the early 50s and began reporting daily to his father in Bombay. You know, any one of us or me who complain about emails, trust me, when you look about the amount of correspondence, remember there was no CC, okay? So if you're writing to 7 brothers, you have to copy the letter 7 times. Can you imagine how tedious and boring it is? I mean, of course, later on, when they became wealthy and affluent, you hire people to copy it. But every day, I think they spent the first hour, hour and a half in the morning just on correspondence, and an hour and a half. And David would give his children hard time if they did not answer right away. And he instituted the rule that all correspondence have to be answered the same day. which was, again, by the way, Farha reinstituted that after his sons dropped that thing. 1857-58 changed everything. East India Company went out. The British opened it to merchants. There was legalization of opium totally in China, and the dissolution, as I said, of the British East India Company. This really shows you what an incredible expansion within 30 years. Remember, again, he had no idea about how to trade. And yet, look at all the dots in yellow. These are all the ports and towns and cities that are expanding. There are 3 red stars. Bombay, the first hub, followed by the second hub, Shanghai, and later on in the 1870s, 18th, the third hub, which is London. You know, one of the things that keeps coming back in the book and people look at it is the fact that they really were a minority. They were migrants. They wanted desperately to be accepted in India and then to be accepted in Britain, which is no different from any migrant family back then or today. Well, let me just talk a little bit briefly about the business. 2 commodities changed Bombay financially and led to the rise of new global merchants: cotton and opium. Though David Sassoon was not involved in those commodities initially, but he began learning it, and David Sassoon rise to be among the top businessmen of Bombay was a slow and gradual. There was not a one event or trade that changed the picture radically. He just kept developing a network of local and foreign traders and trustworthy counterparts, and learning not only where the opportunities lie, but also in the ins and outs of trade and negotiation. For example, cotton. He really, in the 1850s, he watched the bad harvest in America increasing the price of cotton. He entered that trade. And of course, the outbreak of the American Civil War changed everything. Yeah. Cotton prices quadrupled after the outbreak of the war, to the extent there were even rumors that people were tearing apart their mattresses and selling the cotton. I mean, just tells you where it went. But of course, this explosion led to more supply. Brazil entered the market. Egypt became a major producer. India was producing more. So the first 2 years of the Civil War, prices are going up. The last 2 years, prices are going down. By the end of the American Civil War, more than 80% of the traders in Bombay filed bankruptcy because they all got stuck with large supplies. That was the risk averse. He went with the thing. He knew when to get out at the right time. And of course, that created more opportunities. The violent swings in cotton prices illustrates how global merchants conducted their business in the mid-19th century without a fast communication system. Although the telegraph was beginning to be available, it was very expensive and not confidential. One of the things when I talk about confidential, remember, to go from one port to another sometimes took 3 weeks, but that was only part of the problem. 5–7% of the ships never reached their destination because of tycoons, of piracy, of different things. But the worst part, even when they arrived to destinations, the messengers who were carrying them would sell the information to competitors. Guess what? No one could sell the Sassoons ones. Why? Because no one could decode that language. So it became a coded language before coding entered our vocabulary. Information. Two things which you really understand. No difference from 1850s and 20 in our current now. Basically, for successful business, you need two things. You need a good network and you need good information. Nothing has changed. These two fundamentals were there. And the family managed to gather very good information because brothers and families were scattered. And also, they really worked out with their contacts. One of the things that actually I said not much emotion, some of the most interesting correspondence is with people whom they never met. So Abdullah became very friendly, you know, by correspondence with a trader in Isfahan. And 20 years later, you know, every month there is a letter, a friendship developed. And each one suddenly starts saying, oh, I'm having a problem with my son. The other one says, oh, I had some sickness. And that's really one of the very few that came through of this emotion. And I kept thinking, you know, they never spoke because there was no telephone. They never met. And yet this bond has developed very strongly. The other thing that is really remarkable, and I sometimes gave a couple of talks about this to students, how young these people were when they were running the business. I mean, 20 years, first of all, most of the sons and daughters, some of them were sent out to explore and learn Arabic at age 16. Now, the trip from Bombay to Basra would take you at least 6 weeks. Things improved after the opening of the Suez Canal. But the decision making, there was no phone to call daddy or your uncle or whoever and says, what should I do? Okay? Or your mama saying, I'm really worried. There is no such a thing. They were all 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. It's really unbelievable. And we're talking only about 130 years ago, 150 years ago. All these people were in that situation. The second commodity that made Bombay what it was and is opium. There is no doubt whatsoever that British imperialism and colonial interests forced China to purchase opium. The Sassoon began, the trade goes back thousands of years. East India Company regulated it and had a monopoly for something like 300 years before the Sassoon arrived into. And there is no doubt also that Britain and France, and to a certain extent the states in the Second Opium War, they all went there to force China to open its borders and to allow the trade. Why? Very simple trade equation. Britain was importing large quantities of tea, to which they were becoming really almost addicted, and Chinese silk, but there was nothing to export. What do they decide? Opium is what they should, to fill the gap. By the 1850s, and you know, by the way, there were a lot of British firms, Indian merchants. I want to talk a little bit about it because people always say, wow, I think we need to look at this in the eyes and mind of that period and not today's. Is really, really important. And here are the facts. The facts are opium was consumed for 5,000 years in countries like China. If you look at the 18th century, 100 years before the trade gathered momentum, people either used it for recreation or used it for medicine. Today, in India, there are mothers use it to help babies when they are teething. They literally take a very, very tiny and put it on the lips to calm them. The other thing is, people don't realize, and I didn't realize this until I began to do my research. Until 1907, 1908, you could go to any pharmacy in New York or London or Paris and tell the pharmacist that you have a headache or indigestion, and you will get some opium. Hard to understand it today. It really is. But at the end of the 90s, 1890s, Christian religious groups began to fight it. Not for the sake of the benefit of the Chinese, but on the assumption that if there is no opium in China, then they could convert the vast majority of Chinese to Christianity. However, they began to build a lot of pressure. Well, in the sense that they are not, that they will be more sensible. Okay, there is a huge amount of racism in all this about races and the Chinese versus all the time in the correspondence you will see of the different races and how maybe the Chinese are more vulnerable, all kind of nonsense that. But one of the things is, in fact, opium is a very good case where politics and business intervened. Opposition in Britain, mainly in the parliament, began to increase. And by the late 1890s, the government did what usually governments do when they don't want to reach a major decision and upset this side or that side, create a commission of inquiry. This commission went on for 5 years. I actually borrowed the 7 volumes from here, from our library, 2,500 pages, including more than 150 medical experts. Incredible. I'm going to read you verbatim its conclusion. As a result of a searching inquiry and upon a deliberate review of the copious evidence submitted to us, we feel bound to express our conviction that the movement in England in favor of active interference on the part of the Parliament for the suppression of opium habit has proceeded from an exaggerated impression as to the nature and the extent of the evil to be controlled. The gloomy descriptions presented to British audiences of extensive moral and physical degradation by opium have not been accepted by the witnesses representing the people, nor by those most responsible for the government of this country. Clear, no doubt. The medical people came to the committee and said, if you're banning it, then you should ban the next thing, alcohol. And you can imagine the parliamentarians in Britain telling them they're not going to get their whiskey. No, I mean, it was really shocking when you read this. But that, you have to look at it of that sense of mind. It was really an incredible, it removed this discussion, but then World War I came and then opium was controlled by all major governments. You cannot, as an individual or corporation, because they all needed it for their soldiers, given what was going on. Apart from opium and cotton, the other main commodities that the family traded were tea, silk, indigo, rice, and frost. The Sassoons did not, and this is very important, did not engage in money lending. They invested in regular banks. They invested in Bank of Hindustan. They invested in the Imperial Bank of China, of Persia. They were very, very close to the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, which is HSBC, still around. The family was fortunate to have other major factors working in its favor. Global commodity prices began to boom in the second part of the 19th century. British ideology at the time emphasizing free trade. From 1864, the telegraph radically affected global trade as branches began communicating efficiently the price of commodities. And lastly, the development of transport within and outside India helped, and of course, the opening of the Suez Canal. I have just few general comments that are, I think, that are really important, then stop and open it for discussion. One is the connection to homeland. Baghdad was always there among the first and second generations of the Sassoons. Even in the 1850s, they were still referring to Bombay as Balad al-Ingiliz, the home of the English. And for religious questions, they always turned to Baghdad as the center of knowledge. Even in later decades, when the Sassoons intermingled with the English aristocracy and married outside the Baghdadi Jewish circles, they married, for example, the Rothschild, the Gunzburgs, other famous European families. There were reminders of their roots. This is a crest that was created in the 1880s after David had died. One of the fascinating things that I really was amazed by, and this talk about the globalization, the real globalization that existed then versus today. You know, in 100 years of archives, they never asked one member to another in the correspondence, should we not deal or trade with A or B because of their religion, sect, or nationality? Never, ever, ever. It was always the question, only one question: can we trust the counterpart? And that is really fascinating. Think about it today. Immediately people get, boxed who they are, what nationality, religion, sect immediately comes to the forefront. It never came. There are reminiscences of Baghdad with the palm tree, and of course, Candida Constante, and in Hebrew, Enetve Emunah, it's all about trust and truth. Another interesting thing is philanthropy. And this is really an incredible and interesting. One tenet that characterized the Sassoon was their philanthropy. In a truly innovative method, they charge a philanthropy tax on every trade they did, not dissimilar from maritime taxes or insurance. So when I went to look in their trade logs, huge books, you will see chest of tea, cost, maritime transfer, X, maritime insurance, the insurance was like 5-6%. And always the last item, 0.25% philanthropy tax. Now, 1/4% you think it's not a lot, but when you're doing hundreds or even thousands of trade, it accumulates. And this is the difference from other philanthropies. It didn't matter whether the trade was profitable or not. It did, which meant even in a year that they did not have so-called a good profitable year, there was still a lot of money to go to philanthropy. And that was given to education. They opened the first girls' school in Bombay. There was an institute for juveniles. If you go today to Bombay, there is a wonderful Sassoon library. There is the Sassoon docks. I'm going to talk for 2 seconds about the decline, because this is really, sorry, let me just go to the first one to give you a. David Sassoon died in 1864. Left a will very, very clear in the same way that Abdullah should be the next boss. There was no ambiguity about that, and that all other siblings should pay him respect and that he should be continuing the business. The second son, Elias, said, I don't accept this. I have been 6-7 years in China, working harder than anyone, bringing more profit. This is not fair. And for 3 years, there is a lot of back and forth between the brothers. The archives has some tentative agreements, and this is where the archives kind of miss that sentimental, how did they feel? I know afterwards how they felt. 1867, 3 years after the death of David Sassoon, you have 2 competing firms. Elias takes his 2 sons and set up a new company called E.D. Sassoon and Co. Elias David Sassoon. The other one stays at David Sassoon. And it became really confusing to clients. The Chinese had a great way, the old Sassoon, the new Sassoon firms, in order to distinguish between them. Victor, whom you see here, he was the great grandson of Elias. And in fact, once Flora was kicked out or pushed out at the early 20th century, the David Sassoon branch declined really precipitously. The second company found in Victor a new way of life and the move to Shanghai. But remember, the family lost everything in 1949 with the nationalization of all foreign assets, including 19 major buildings in China. And so that comes to the end. I'm going to stop here and take questions.
Thank you.